I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Not because this story is going to be comfortable, not because it's going to be clean or simple, or the kind of thing that gets wrapped up nice at the end. I want you to stop because the thing that happened at Tareth Station, the thing that most people still don't fully understand, started with a woman carrying a thermos. That's it, that's the whole setup. A thermos, stainless steel, dented on one side from when she dropped it on the Martian transit deck about 3 years before the station incident. She'd kept it because she said the dent gave it character. She'd kept it because she's the kind of person who keeps things. Her name was Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez, and she was 37 years old, and she had eyes the color of dark coffee, and she absolutely did not look like the kind of person who was going to change the way 3 different alien species thought about human beings. But that's the thing about humans. We never look like what we are until we have to be. Tareth Station sat at the gravitational midpoint between the Veraxi Corridor and what the Galactic Senate had officially designated Neutral Space Zone 7, though nobody who actually worked out there called it that. We called it the Gray Rim, a place where the laws got thin, where the treaties held up because everyone was too tired to fight, not because anyone particularly believed in them. It was a refueling hub mostly. A place where cargo haulers stopped, where diplomatic transports made scheduled maintenance checks, where the station crew kept 17 different life support systems running simultaneously because 17 different species breathed 17 different atmospheric mixes. And if you let the Cathali section's nitrogen scrubbers backflush into the Veraxi oxygen module, you had a very bad day. Elena was stationed there as part of the Human Defense Compact's peacekeeping rotation, 3rd posting in 4 years. She'd done the Kepler belt before this, and before that, something near the outer ring that she wasn't allowed to talk about in specifics, only in vague gestures and a certain tired look around the eyes that said it was worse than you'd think. She'd arrived at Tareth 17 months before the incident. By the time it happened, she knew every corridor, every access panel, every atmospheric seal. She knew which sections had pressure differentials that made the walls creak after 300 hours, and she knew which of the Cathali maintenance crew left their equipment in the wrong storage bay. And she knew that the vending unit on level 4, the one near the secondary docking ring, had a mechanical fault that would give you 2 protein packs if you pressed the selection button while simultaneously tapping the temperature control on the side. She knew that because she'd done it once by accident, and she'd been giving the 2nd protein pack to whoever looked hungry ever since. 17 months. She knew that station the way you know a place you've lived in, not just worked in. Which is exactly why she was there, in the corridor outside Bay 7, when the Tareth Kale warship docked without a scheduled appointment. Let me tell you about the Tareth Kale. Because a lot of people, when they hear that name now after everything, they think they know what the Tareth Kale are. They've seen the media coverage. They've seen the footage. They think the Tareth Kale are villains, or they think they're misunderstood, or they think they're political pawns in a bigger game, and none of those framings are quite right. The Tareth Kale were a military civilization, full stop. Every part of their culture, their social structure, their art, their language, their architecture, was built around the concept of dominance hierarchies enforced through demonstrated capability. If you were stronger, faster, more lethal, more tactically brilliant, you rose. If you weren't, you served someone who was. They were not cruel exactly. Cruelty implies enjoying another being's suffering, and the Tareth Kale were too practical for that. What they were was honest about power. No pretending. No diplomatic softening. If they were stronger than you, they said so. If they thought you were weak, you'd know it. If they considered your species a military nonentity, they made that clear in the first 5 minutes of any introduction. They'd made it clear about humans in the first 5 minutes of our introduction, 15 years before the station incident. We were small, we were short-lived, we bled too easily. Our weapons technology had been impressive for Deathworlders, they'd acknowledged, but our tactical doctrine was inconsistent. Our command structures were chaotic by their standards, and we had the bizarre habit of forming emotional attachments to non-optimal personnel, keeping soldiers who were injured rather than rotating them out, committing resources to rescue operations that had negative strategic value, running toward danger instead of away from it. They found that last part especially baffling. Commander Vreethsal had been the one to say it, in that first official contact. He'd looked at the footage of human soldiers in combat, soldiers who'd been filmed doing things like throwing themselves on ordnance to protect crew members, soldiers who'd kept fighting on broken legs, soldiers who'd spent 4 hours in hard vacuum because there was still one survivor in the wreckage worth reaching, and he'd said, in his flat, translated voice, "Your species has a defect. You don't value your own survival correctly." And the human diplomat at the table had taken a breath and said, very quietly, "No, we just value other things more." The Tarith Kale had found that incomprehensible, charming in the way a child's logic is charming, not threatening. They hadn't updated their assessment in 15 years. That was their mistake. Alina was heading back from the level 4 vending unit, thermos in one hand, extra protein pack in the other, already thinking about who to give it to when the dock alert sounded. Not the standard docking chime, the other one, the one that meant unscheduled contact. She stopped walking. The corridor lights shifted from standard white to the amber tone that meant heightened monitoring. Around her, 3 other station crew members paused too. A Kethali maintenance tech named Esrova, who was carrying a diagnostic tool the size of a small tree. A human comms officer named Yusuf, who had a stylus behind one ear and a half-eaten nutrition bar in his hand. And one of the Veraxi diplomatic aides who'd been posted to Tarith for the past 6 months. A small, quiet creature named Tessevel, who communicated primarily through color shifts across her skin membrane, and had learned exactly enough human words to order coffee. Tessevel turned pale gray, which meant worried. Alina said, "Stay here," and started moving toward the primary monitoring center at a walk that was not quite a jog, but was absolutely not a stroll. The monitoring center on Tarith was a cramped room with too many screens and not enough chairs. By the time Alina got there, Station Commander Rourke was already at the main console, and he looked exactly the way people look when they've just seen something they weren't prepared for. "Talk to me," Alina said. Rourke pulled up the external feed. "Tarith Kale warship, Verath class, that's a command vessel. They don't have any scheduled contact." "No. Diplomatic channels. Open, they're transmitting on the standard hail frequency." He paused. "They're requesting an audience." Alina set her thermos down on the console edge. She looked at the feed. The Verath-class ship was big. Not enormous by galactic standards, but big in the way that something is big when it's bigger than your station, and it's currently docked at your station's primary bay. Long hull, dark composite plating, the Tarith Kale's signature angular construction that made their ships look like something between a blade and a clenched fist. "Who's requesting?" she said. Rourke read from his screen, "Commander Vreethsal." The room went quiet. Everyone in that room knew that name. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. Vreethsal wasn't a diplomat. Vreethsal was the Tarith Kale's senior military commander in this sector. He had authority over a fleet of 47 vessels. He had personally overseen the annexation of 2 contested systems in the last decade. He was, by any measure you could use, one of the most powerful military figures in this region of space. He did not make station visits. "What does he want?" Alina said. Rourke looked up from his screen. "He's invoking Article 7 of the Galactic Senate's Joint Access Treaty. He wants to inspect the station's defensive installations." Alina looked at him. "He says," Rourke continued slowly, that he has reason to believe Tareth Station is harboring weapons technology in violation of the neutral zone protocols. Is it? No. Then we have nothing to worry about. Rourke did not look reassured. Alina, he's got 47 ships in this sector. She picked up her thermos. And we've got Article 7, let him inspect. She paused. Have someone set up a formal meeting room. Not the diplomatic lounge, he'll see that as soft. Use the tactical briefing room on level 2. Put good lights in there. And for the love of everything, make sure the atmospheric calibration is running right so he's not breathing too much nitrogen. She turned to leave. Where are you going? Rourke asked. To finish my coffee, she said. I'll be at the briefing room in 20 minutes. I talked to Yusuf about this later. He'd been standing outside the monitoring center when Alina came out, and he said he'd tried to ask her how she was feeling, whether she was worried, whether she thought this was going to be a problem. He said she'd looked at him for a moment, and then she'd looked down at her thermos, and then she'd said, "The thing about people who come to check on you is that they usually expect to find something. When they don't, they get confused. Confused people make mistakes. Pay attention to the mistakes." He'd asked her what she meant. She'd just taken a sip of her coffee and kept walking. Part 2, the inspection. The tactical briefing room on level 2 had been designed, at some point in Tareth Station's operational history, to host 12 people comfortably. The Tareth Kale delegation was 6. Alina's team was 4 herself, Rourke, a human legal liaison named Dr. Petra Wolf, who specialized in galactic treaty law, and had the posture of someone who'd spent a lot of time in rooms full of hostile entities, and learned to take up space anyway, and a young ensign named Marcus Webb who'd been on Tareth for 4 months and was very clearly trying not to show how scared he was, and not entirely succeeding. Vreethsal arrived. I want to be precise about this, because I've heard descriptions since that make him sound like a monster, and that's not accurate. He wasn't a monster. He was a very tall, very composed, very controlled individual with the particular quality of stillness that the Tareth Kale cultivated in their senior officers. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, it's compression. Energy stored, not expended. He was wearing full command regalia, which for Tareth Kale meant dark composite armor with rank markings etched along the shoulder plates, and he moved through the doorway with the specific economy of motion that spoke to years of operating in confined spaces, while still managing to project the impression that the confined space was only confined relative to him. He was flanked by 5 officers who were, to a being, larger than anyone on Alina's team. They looked at the humans the way you look at something unfamiliar, not quite contemptuous, not quite curious, something in between, like they were trying to figure out how to categorize you and finding the categories insufficient. Vreethsal looked at Alina. She looked back. She didn't stand up straighter, she didn't adjust her posture, she was just there, the way a wall is there. "Sergeant Major Vasquez," he said. His translator unit was embedded in the collar of his armor. It rendered his words into standard galactic with a half-second delay that made his sentences arrive like deliberate decisions. "Commander Vreethsal," she said, "welcome to Tareth Station, please sit." He sat, his officers remained standing. Standard Tareth Kale protocol, the commander negotiates, the officers observe. Alina's team sat too, except Marcus, who remained standing by the door, which he'd obviously decided was the right call without being told, and Alina made a mental note to tell him later that he'd read the room correctly. "You know why I'm here," Vreethsal said. "You've invoked Article 7, Alina said. "You want to inspect our defensive installations." "I have reports." He placed a data module on the table between them. 3 separate intelligence assessments indicating that Tareth Station has received and is housing prohibited weapons technology. Technology that violates the terms of your station's neutral zone designation. Dr. Wolf slid the data module toward herself and started reviewing. Alina didn't look at it. She looked at Vreeth Sal. "What kind of technology?" she said. "Resonance disruptors," he said. "Class 4 or higher, targeted atmospheric destabilizers. Possibly," he paused. A very small pause. "Mnemonic dissonance emitters." Rourke made a sound, not a loud one, just a breath. Mnemonic dissonance emitters were a specific kind of terrible. They didn't damage physical structures. They didn't destroy ships or breach hulls. What they did was interfere with cognitive function across multiple species simultaneously, disrupting memory formation, communication processing, judgment. They were the kind of weapon that could neutralize a military force not by killing them, but by making them unable to coordinate. They were also prohibited absolutely under the Galactic Senate's War Ethics Accords. Prohibited so completely that possession of even the component parts carried diplomatic consequences. "We don't have any of those things," Alina said. "I'd like to confirm that," Vreeth Sal said. "You're welcome to." Alina folded her hands on the table. "Under Article 7, you have the right to inspect any station installation you reasonably believe may be housing prohibited materials. Dr. Wolf will accompany the inspection team to ensure procedural compliance. I'll walk you through the station personally." Vreeth Sal looked at her. The same look he'd given her when he walked in, the categorization look. "That's not standard procedure," he said. "Typically, the station's senior command officer leads inspection tour. Commander Rourke has administrative responsibilities that can't be interrupted mid-station day," Alina said. "I'm his operational second. I know this station better than anyone." A pause. The Tareth Kale officers behind Vreeth Sal exchanged glances, very small glances, the kind you learn to catch when you've been operating in multilingual, multifaceted diplomatic spaces for long enough. Alina caught them. "Very well," Vreeth Sal said. The inspection started in the lower equipment bays. "This is the part where I need you to understand something about how Tareth Station was actually laid out, because it matters for what comes next. Tareth was not a weapon station. It was a service and supply hub. Its primary installations were atmospheric processing, energy distribution, medical facilities scaled for 15 different biological categories, and a cargo management system that could track 30,000 individual items simultaneously. Its defensive armaments were minimal, a handful of beam weapons mounted on the outer hull that existed primarily to deter piracy and had never been fired in operational conditions. Its security systems were non-lethal by neutral zone mandate. What Tareth did have in extraordinary abundance was equipment, maintenance equipment, medical equipment, atmospheric equipment, fuel processing equipment, communication equipment. Kilometers of corridors lined with things that help things work. The kind of infrastructure that makes stations run, that nobody ever thinks about, that sits in cabinets and lockers and access panels doing its quiet, unglamorous job. It was a perfectly ordinary station. Which meant that when Vreeth Sal and his officers walked through it, seeing perfectly ordinary things, the question hanging in the air between them and Alina was, what had their intelligence told them to expect, and why didn't it match what they were seeing? Alina walked them through Level 1 first, power distribution, atmospheric processing, the life support arrays. Vreeth Sal's senior technical officer, a being named Kathiron who had 4 upper limbs and the specific energy of someone who was very good at their job and knew it, paused at every equipment housing and ran scanner readings. Standard procedure. Everything came back clean. They moved to Level 2, communications arrays, navigation support, the medical wing. In the medical wing, they paused at the biosynthetic recovery units, large, enclosed pods that could be reconfigured to support multiple biological categories. Kathiron scanned them. Clean. Level 3, cargo management, secondary power, the fuel processing center. In the fuel processing center, one of the Tareth Kale officers pointed at a piece of equipment mounted on the far wall, a large, cylindrical unit with a series of emitter nodes running along its surface. "What is that?" the officer said. Alina looked at it. "Atmospheric pressure equalizer. We have 3 of them in this section. They keep the pressure stable between the fuel processing bays and the cargo section, which run at different atmospheric densities." Cathiron scanned it, took longer this time, read the results, scanned it again. "These emitter nodes," he said, "the frequency range is standard atmospheric regulation," Alina said. "It operates at 0.3 to 0.7 terahertz. You're looking at the harmonic distribution." She walked to the unit, not fast, not slow, and opened the access panel on its side. "Here's the technical spec plate. See the operational parameters." Cathiron looked at the plate, looked at his scanner. His head tilted, a Tareth Kale gesture that meant recalibration of expectation. They moved on. Level 4 was where Alina had been heading when the dock alert sounded. The vending unit, the secondary docking ring, the crew quarters for the rotating peacekeeping personnel. And in one storage bay, Bay 4C, behind a standard access panel, the thing that Vreethsal's intelligence had apparently flagged. Alina stopped in front of the bay before they reached it. "Commander," she said, "before we go into this section, I want to be transparent with you." Vreethsal looked at her, the categorization look again. "There's something in Bay 4C that your scanner may flag as anomalous," she said. "I want to explain it before you see it, because I'd prefer this not to become a misunderstanding." The air in the corridor changed quality. Not literally, the atmospheric systems were perfect, they always were. But the energy of the space shifted. Vreethsal's officers moved fractionally, that unconscious spreading of presence that combat-trained beings do when they think something is about to happen. Vreethsal said, "Show me." Bay 4C was a standard storage bay, metal walls, mounted shelving, emergency equipment lockers in the standard positions. A workbench along the far wall, where crew did equipment maintenance. And on the workbench, sitting in a secured transport case with its latches open, was the item in question. Vreethsal stepped forward, his officers spread out behind him. Cathiron raised his scanner. The item in the case was, Alina watched Vreethsal's face as he processed it, unexpected. It was a device about 40 centimeters long, cylindrical primarily, but with a series of nested emitter rings along its body and a configuration interface at one end, and what looked very much like a focused output nozzle at the other. Cathiron ran his scan, the readings came back. And his head did that tilting thing again. "The emitter frequency range," he said, "is consistent with a Class 3 resonance disruptor," Vreethsal said very quietly. He hadn't taken his eyes off the device. "At first reading." "Yes," Cathiron said, "but—" "At first reading," Vreethsal repeated. He looked at Alina. She was standing 2 meters away, one hand at her side, the other holding her thermos. She'd been holding her thermos the whole time, through the entire inspection, up and down the corridors, through every equipment bay, through every scanner reading. Now, standing in Bay 4C, looking at the device that had apparently triggered her commander's intelligence files, she took a slow sip of her coffee. "Commander," she said, "that is a targeted atmospheric regulation probe. It's used for precision atmospheric adjustment in small, sealed spaces, shuttle interiors, personnel airlocks, emergency medical pods. It operates at a frequency range that overlaps with certain prohibited weapon signatures when you're only scanning the output spectrum, but the power delivery system, the control architecture, the target resolution, none of those match a resonance disruptor. Your intelligence got a partial signature and jumped to a conclusion." Vreethsal looked at the device. He looked at Cathiron. "Confirm." Cathiron ran a deeper scan. It took 40 seconds. She's correct, he said. The core architecture is atmospheric regulation, medical-grade precision equipment. The frequency overlap is incidental. A pause. A long one. Vreethsal looked at Alina. You knew we were going to flag that, he said. Yes, she said. Before the inspection. Yes. And you didn't remove it. She looked at him. Why would I? It's not contraband. It's atmospheric regulation equipment. Removing it before your inspection would have looked like we were hiding something. Letting you see it, explaining it, letting your officer confirm it, that's how you know we're not hiding anything. She paused. Commander, your intelligence was wrong. I understand that's not an easy thing to hear. But the fact that we invited you in and walked you through every level of this station and gave you access to every bay should tell you something. Vreethsal was silent for a moment. Then he said, You weren't worried about this inspection. I was working, she said. There's a difference. He looked at the device in the case. Then he looked at Alina's thermos. Something in his expression shifted, not much, not dramatically, just the faintest movement of something. That's not a weapon, he said. He meant the atmospheric probe. Alina looked at the case. No, she said. And this is the part that Yusuf told me about later, that Marcus told me about later, that Cathiron himself apparently mentioned in his post-inspection report. Alina Vasquez looked back at Commander Vreethsal, and she grinned. Not a smile, not a diplomatic expression, a grin, the kind that knows something. Depends who's holding it, she said. Part 3, what she meant. The inspection concluded 40 minutes later. Vreethsal's team found nothing. No resonance disruptors, no atmospheric destabilizers, no mnemonic dissonance emitters, no prohibited technology of any category. Tarith Station was exactly what it was supposed to be, a service hub, a refueling point, a place where ships stopped and got what they needed and moved on. In the tactical briefing room for the formal close of inspection, Vreethsal sat across from Alina again and said, I owe your station an apology. Our intelligence was in error. Appreciated, Alina said. He looked at her for a moment, that look. You said something, he said, in Bay 4C about the atmospheric probe. He paused. Depends who's holding it. Yes, she said. Explain. And this is the part that people have talked about since. This is the part that got recorded. Rourke had left the room's documentation systems running, which was standard procedure, and Dr. Wolf had her own notes, and Marcus had been taking down everything with that fierce concentration that young ensigns use when they know they're watching something they're going to want to remember. Alina set her thermos on the table between them. When your people first met ours, she said, you assessed us. You looked at our biology, our technology, our combat doctrine, our tactical record. You made a determination. We did, Vreethsal said. You determined we were not a significant military threat. Correct. Because we were small, short-lived, because we bled easily, because our equipment was primitive relative to yours. Because our tactical doctrine was, how was it described? Inconsistent. Those were the assessments, yes. But there was one thing, Alina said, that didn't fit the assessment. Something your people kept noting in the field reports. Something you couldn't quite categorize. Vreethsal said nothing. He was watching her the way a very good military mind watches something it's trying to understand. We run toward things, Alina said. Not away from them. We run toward the explosion, toward the hull breach, toward the person who needs pulling out of the wreckage. We do things that have negative strategic value by every calculation your doctrine uses. She paused. Your first commander said we had a defect. That we didn't value our own survival correctly. Yes. He was wrong, Alina said. We value our survival fine, we also value other things more, and that's not a defect, that's a capability. She leaned forward very slightly. An atmospheric probe, standard equipment, medical grade atmospheric regulation, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary. In the hands of a standard operator, it adjusts atmospheric pressure in small, sealed environments. It does exactly what it's designed to do. She paused. But a human who knows this station, who has spent 17 months learning every corridor, every atmospheric seal, every pressure differential, every section and subsection, can use that probe to do things that it was absolutely not designed to do. They can create localized pressure cascades that would knock a pressurized assault team unconscious in 40 seconds without killing anyone. They can reverse engineer the atmospheric gradient between the fuel processing bays and the cargo section to create a buffer zone that disrupts directed energy weapons targeting systems. They can, if they need to, build a low-yield sonic resonance pulse from 3 atmospheric regulation probes and a salvaged communication relay that would, technically qualify as a Class II dissonance emitter. The room was very quiet. Vreathsal was looking at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before. "Is that theoretical?" he said. 17 months, she said, not answering the question. "I know every piece of equipment on this station. I know what it does, and I know what else it can do. And here's the thing about your intelligence assessment, Commander. Your people flagged an atmospheric probe as a potential resonance disruptor because the frequency signatures overlapped on a surface scan. That overlap is real. It's incidental, and this particular probe is absolutely not a weapon. But the fact that your intelligence was sophisticated enough to flag it," she picked up her thermos again, "means your people are actually pretty good at reading signals. They just read the wrong signal." "What was the right signal?" Vreathsal asked. Elena looked at him. "That the humans who have been living on this station for 17 months have had 17 months to figure out what everything here can do, and what it can do differently, and under what conditions those differences matter." She took a sip. "You came to inspect for prohibited weapons. You didn't find any, but you walked right past at least 11 different equipment arrays that a station crew with the right training could repurpose in a combat situation. You didn't ask about any of them. Because they don't look like weapons." A pause. A very long pause. Vreathsal said, very carefully, "Are you telling me this station is defensible?" "I'm telling you," Elena said, "that this station is defended, past tense, already. By the people who have been living in it and learning it." She met his eyes. "And I'm telling you that because I think it's more honest than letting you leave with a mistaken impression in the other direction." Vreathsal sat back in his chair. The movement was very small, but in a being trained to compression and economy, it was significant. Something had recalibrated. "You walk through a station inspection," he said slowly, holding a thermos. "Yes. And no one looks twice." "No one looks twice," Elena said, "because a thermos isn't a weapon." And she grinned at him again. Not aggressive, not showing off, just honestly amused, the way someone grins when they've been sitting on a thought for a long time and finally got to say it. "Depends," she said, "who's holding it." Part 4, the conversation after. Vreathsal stayed on the station for 3 more hours after the formal inspection closed. He asked to speak with Elena informally. Rourke agreed. With the appropriate documentation, station protocol required that any informal communication with a foreign military officer of that rank be logged. And they ended up in the small commissary near the Level 2 junction, which was a battered room with 4 tables and a beverage dispenser that made something that wasn't quite coffee, but was in the same general direction as coffee. Marcus was outside the door, not hovering, just outside. Elena sat across from Vreathsal, and she had her thermos, and he had a regulation water vessel that one of his officers had brought for him. And they sat there for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have each taken the measure of the other, and are now deciding how to be straightforward. Vreathsal said, Your species has been a subject of ongoing military assessment by the Tarith Kale since initial contact. I know, Elena said. The assessment has remained largely stable. I know that too. It may need to be revised. Elena looked at him, not triumphant, not smug, just listening. Not because of weapons capability, Vreethsal said carefully. Your weapons technology remains, he paused. Say it, Elena said. Below our developmental threshold, he said. In terms of raw armament, destructive yield, fleet capacity. Yes, Elena said. But your assessment, he stopped again, started over. The way you conducted this inspection, the preparation, the transparency as a strategy, walking me through the station knowing what I would see, explaining it before I could misinterpret it, demonstrating the incidental overlap before I could flag it as suspicious. That's doctrine, Elena said. He tilted his head, Tarith Kale gesture for explain. We've been assessing your assessment, she said. For 15 years. We know what the Tarith Kale expect to see when they look at human-operated installations. We know the heuristics your intelligence teams use. We know the frequency signatures that trigger flags. We know the architectural patterns you associate with prohibited technology. She paused. So when your people flagged Tarith Station, and we got the preliminary intelligence that an inspection was incoming, we had about 6 days to prepare. Vreethsal looked at her. You knew we were coming. We had a strong indication, yes. And you didn't remove the atmospheric probe from Bay 4C. We put it there, she said. The commissary was very quiet for a moment. You staged it, Vreethsal said. We put equipment that we knew would trigger an initial scanner flag in an accessible, visible location, with full documentation available. We then walked you directly to it, explained it before it could become a confrontation, and let your own officer confirm the explanation independently. She looked at him steadily. You came here looking for proof of prohibited weapons. You found proof of prohibited weapons in the shape of something that isn't a weapon, and your officer confirmed it wasn't a weapon. Now you have confirmed, personally and officially, that Tarith Station is clean. Your intelligence was wrong. The matter is closed. Vreethsal stared at her. At the same time, Elena said, we've demonstrated that we know what your intelligence looks for. We know how your scanners read atmospheric equipment. We know how your reports get written. We know, she took a sip of coffee, how you think. She set the thermos down. And none of that required a single weapon, she said. Vreethsal was quiet for a long time. Then he said, this was a message. This was a conversation, she said. One I thought we should probably have, given that we're going to be sharing this sector for the foreseeable future. What do you want from this conversation? Elena thought about that. For you to update your assessment, she said. Not about our weapons capability. That's accurate. We're not going to be winning any direct arms comparisons with the Tarith Kale in the near future. I'm not pretending otherwise. She met his eyes. But I want you to update your assessment of what we're capable of when we've had time to understand our environment, when we've lived somewhere for 17 months, when we know every corridor and every piece of equipment and every atmospheric differential. She paused. We're small. We're short-lived. We bleed easily. All of that is true, but we learn fast and we remember everything we learn, and we solve problems in ways that don't look like solutions until they're already done. Vreethsal looked at the table between them, at his water vessel, at Elena's thermos. The running toward things, he said. Yes. It's not a defect. No, she said. It's a preference for proximity. We like to understand things up close. We like to be in the situation, in the problem, in the room. She looked around the commissary. In the station, for 17 months, learning what everything does. She looked back at him. It's not strategy in the way your doctrine defines strategy. It's something else. Something that doesn't have a name in Tarith Kale military terminology as far as I know. You build plans. We build relationships with places, with equipment, with situations. We become part of the environment. And when we're part of the environment, she picked up the thermos one more time. Everything becomes something we can use. Vriethsal looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, 15 years ago, my predecessor told your diplomat that your species had a defect. Yes. He was wrong. He was working with incomplete information, Alina said generously. Something not quite a smile, because the Tareth Kale facial structure doesn't produce expressions that map onto human smiles, but something in Vriethsal's face did something that might have been its equivalent. A small release of tension, a recognition. What is in the thermos? He asked. Coffee, she said, black, no sugar. And if someone asked you whether it was a weapon? Alina looked at the thermos in her hand. At the dent on its side from 3 years ago on the Martian transit deck, the dent she'd kept because it gave it character. She grinned. Depends who's holding it, she said. Part 5. What happened after? The official record of the Tareth station inspection was filed 3 days later. It confirmed that the station was fully compliant with neutral zone protocols. No prohibited materials. No violations. Vriethsal's report, submitted to the Tareth Kale High Command, contained, according to the portions later shared through diplomatic channels, a formal recommendation to revise the sector assessment of human-operated installations. It also contained, in a section classified for another 4 years, and only declassified because a Galactic Senate Transparency Review pulled it into the light, a passage that people have been quoting since. What it said, roughly translated, was, the human facility at Tareth demonstrated neither superior armament nor advanced weapons technology. However, the facility's operating personnel demonstrated a quality that does not map cleanly onto existing Tareth Kale military assessment frameworks. They have been present in this environment long enough to understand it at a level that transforms the environment itself into a strategic resource. They did not present as threats. They presented as knowledgeable. The distinction, upon reflection, may be less significant than it appears. Recommend treating all extended presence human installations as operationally complex regardless of visible armament levels. He also noted, in a footnote, which became something of a legend in itself, that the human sergeant major had carried a thermos of coffee through the entire inspection and had offered to refill his water vessel from it at the end of the formal session, which he had declined. He noted in the footnote that in retrospect he thought he should have accepted. Alina stayed on Tareth Station for 8 more months after the inspection. In that time, 3 things happened. First, the Tareth Kale did update their assessment. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in the sector, in the practical working relationship between their vessels and human-operated stations, something shifted. Ships that would have buzzed close to Tareth as a casual demonstration of presence started giving it more distance. Inspection requests went through proper channels on proper schedules instead of arriving unannounced. It was quiet, the way real change is often quiet. No announcements, just different behavior. Second, Kathiron, the Tareth Kale technical officer who'd run the scanner readings during the inspection, requested a formal technical exchange program with Tareth Station. He wanted to understand the atmospheric regulation probe more thoroughly. He wanted to understand how humans calibrated equipment for multi-species atmospheric environments. He came back twice in the 8 months Alina was still there, and on his second visit, Esrova, the Kethali maintenance tech, spent 4 hours showing him the diagnostic tool she carried everywhere and how it interfaced with the station's atmospheric grid. Kathiron filed a report about that exchange too. It was not classified. It simply said, humans and their allied personnel demonstrate an integration of institutional knowledge that is distinct from our own technical training model, worth continued study. Third, The atmospheric probe from Bay 4C was formally catalogued as standard equipment and filed in the official station inventory. It remained on the workbench in Bay 4C fully documented, completely transparent. Alina added a note to its inventory record that read, Standard Atmospheric Regulation Probe, Medical Grade, Non-Weapon, Deployed Standard Protocols, Handle Accordingly. Below that, in smaller text, whether she did it intentionally or not, whether she thought anyone would notice, I genuinely don't know, she'd added. Unless you know what you're doing. I talked to Marcus Webb about this, 6 months after Alina's rotation ended and she moved on to her next posting. He was still on Tarath, promoted to lieutenant by then, starting to have the look of someone who knows their station the way a person knows a place they've lived in, not just worked in. He told me that the thing he'd taken away from the Vrithsal inspection wasn't the grin, or the thermos, or the line about what depends on who's holding it. He said the thing that stuck with him was something Alina had said before the inspection started, before Vrithsal arrived, when it was just the team in the briefing room, getting ready. She'd said, here's the thing about being small. Everyone watches the big things. Everyone watches the fleet movements and the armament specs and the weapon signatures. Nobody watches the person carrying the thermos. She'd looked around the room. Be the person carrying the thermos, she'd said. Know your station. Know what everything does and what else it can do. Be the part of this environment that knows the environment. And when someone comes to find out what you're hiding, show them everything, honestly, completely. Because when you do that, the thing you're actually telling them is this. Everything you can see here, I understand. Everything you missed, I understand that too. Marcus told me that when he said that part back, he'd looked down at the table for a moment. Then he'd said, she was terrifying. He said it the way you say something that you mean as the highest possible compliment. Part 6, the longer thing. Okay. I want to step back from the story for a minute, or not step back, step sideways, come at it from a different angle. Because the Tarath Station incident is interesting on its own, it makes a good story. Soldier holds her ground against an intimidating inspection, diffuses a potential diplomatic crisis, walks the intimidating military commander through her own station and sends him home with a revised assessment. That's satisfying. That's a story. But I think the thing people miss when they hear it is the longer arc. The Tarath Kale had been watching humans for 15 years before the Vrithsal inspection. They'd been gathering intelligence, running assessments, updating their tactical evaluations. They'd had the same contact with humanity that everyone had: the treaties, the Senate meetings, the joint operations in contested zones, the trade negotiations. They'd seen human soldiers fight. They'd seen human diplomats operate. They'd read the reports. And they'd consistently, systematically underestimated what they were looking at. Not because they were stupid. The Tarath Kale are many things, but they're not stupid. They underestimated us because they were using their framework. They were asking, how does this species perform on the metrics we use to evaluate military capability? And by those metrics we were limited. By the scale they were used to, we were small. But here's the thing about humans that every species in the Galactic Senate has had to learn the hard way, at one point or another. We are not impressive by volume. We don't win on scale. We don't dominate through obvious displays of power or overwhelming force or resources that simply outclass everything else in the room. What we do is something else. Something that doesn't fit cleanly into the categories people expect. We show up, we stay, we learn, we adapt. We look at a thing and ask not just what is this, but what else could this be? We walk into environments and we become part of them, and in becoming part of them, we change them. We build relationships with places the way other species build fortifications, not by constructing barriers, but by understanding the terrain, the equipment, the atmospheric differentials, the vending machine that gives you 2 protein packs if you tap the right spot. We're the people carrying the thermos. We always have been. And here's the thing about that. The Tareth Kale adjusted their assessment after Vreethsal's inspection. They got quieter about their casual demonstrations of presence. They filed their inspection requests through proper channels. They started treating human-operated stations as operationally complex environments regardless of visible armament. 3 years after the Tareth Station incident, a joint Tareth Kale and Human Defense Compact operation in the outer Varaxi corridor succeeded largely because the human squad operating in a damaged corridor section improvised a communications relay from atmospheric regulation equipment and a salvaged navigational array, maintaining contact with the Kale vessels for 6 hours when standard communication channels were knocked out. Kathiran was on that operation. He reportedly said afterward, "I don't know how they did that." The human tech sergeant on the team had apparently looked at him and said, 17 months. He'd asked what she meant. She just grinned. Vreethsal retired from active command 4 years after the Tareth inspection. In his final address to the Tareth Kale High Command, which was declassified because, again, transparency reviews, he said something that the diplomatic community has been discussing since. He said of the human species, "Do not assess them by what they carry. Assess them by how long they have been carrying it and what they have learned about everything in the room since they sat down." He said, "We made the error of watching for weapons. We should have been watching for understanding." And then, in a line that nobody quite expected from a Tareth Kale military commander in a formal address to his high command, he said, "I was offered coffee on a station inspection, and I declined it. I believe this was the only mistake I made that day. It remains the most instructive.